Okay, so this is chapter 3. The shirt I'm wearing today is from an image of Fred Hampton, who was from Chicago. He was a revolutionary leader who was killed by the Chicago police at the age of 21. One thing I love about Fred is that he was very clear about what his identity was, and he remains in our consciousness, I believe, because he was so clear about who he was and what he was about. So I'm coming to you live from my office here at Oakwood University at Cunningham Hall, the famed and legend Cunningham Hall. And today we are talking about self-attributes and identity. That's coming from chapter 3 from Belgrave and Allison's 2019 book called African American Psychology. Before we get started, I wanted to pray, and then we'll get into these notes here, because a lot of notes packed into chapter 3, and I don't have a lot of time. I don't want to waste your time with a bunch of extra fluff. So let me pray. Dear Lord, thank you for this opportunity to discuss self-identity and awareness and our own growth. Please be with me as I share this information for our students here at Oakwood, but also for those who are interested. And as you say, wherever 2 or 3 are gathered, you are in the midst, so help us be able to grow. In your son's precious name, amen. All right, so self-attributes and identity. Again, it's chapter 3. And I like to start off most of my lectures with our students at Oakwood with a book called Sabbath Roots by C.E. Bradford. And one of the quotes I have from page 82 of that book says that we think of Egypt as Israel's nemesis and God's perennial enemy, but Yahweh speaks of Egypt almost in familial terms of endearment. So if we look at the Bible, or we look at many ancient texts, if we think of ourselves as particularly Africans in America or African Americans, oftentimes when we hear of this Judeo-Christian story of Egypt, we tend to think of it as a foreign, othered type experience. But really, as you see the colors behind me from the red, black, and the green, come directly from Africa. And Africa is seen as a part of a broader connection within the larger story of humanity. And I think C.E. Bradford reminds us of that when we discuss even the idea on identity and connectedness. So some of the topics we'll go over today are vocabulary, also the understanding of self. We'll talk about some scales or measures of racial and ethnic identity. We'll get into concepts of identity as well as concepts of gender. And we'll also briefly touch on some of the programs for increasing positive racial and ethnic identity socialization. All right, so let me just at least tell you what some of these vocabulary words are. You can look them up, but I won't be able to break down each of them, but I'll spend just a moment on some of them, especially because they're not in the book. So intersectionality, that's coming from Kimberly Crenshaw, and we'll define that a bit more, but that's important to understand. Another concept that I do really try to have psychologists, future psychologists aware of is this concept of risk versus protective factors, right? And there's factors in life that may lead to greater risk, right? And we'll talk about some of those, but I just generally think of, I'm a surfer, right? And people say, man, aren't you afraid of sharks? Well, I'm more afraid of being killed on the freeway that I used to drive almost every day, the 405 freeway in Southern California, than I was ever afraid of being attacked by the shark, because the risk for getting into an accident is much greater than being attacked by a shark, right? So risk, that's a big deal. But also there's protective factors that happen when you're in a car, when you're in the water, and there's protective factors as you live your life. So risk and protective factors. Self-esteem and self-concept will define social identity, will define race and ethnic identity. And I'll just pause here on race and ethnic identity. These are two separate concepts. Race is and has come to be a social construct. At one point, people thought it was a biological determinant, and really had some other kind of factors that went along with it, but really it's a social construct much of the way we use it within society. And I'll leave that there. And we'll come back to those definitions of sexual identity, gender, right? Identity development, the concept of schema. If you've taken some 100 level or 200 level psychology courses, schema is important to understand. It's generally kind of a cognitive construction of how you view your world or how you perceive your world, right? Ethnic identity change is important to understand. Nigrescence models of identity development, and we'll get into some of those. Correlates, just a good vocabulary word to know as a social science researcher. Socialization. Feminism and womanism, right? And I'm not necessarily opposing those two, but I want us to understand the difference with those. Masculinity and hypermasculinity, as well as toxic masculinity by Coopers, and phallicism by Curry. So we'll get into some of these vocabulary words, but if you wanted to go back and take a look at some of those, I think it may be important for you to understand this. But if you've been following a lot of these discussions around Black social theory, Black psychology, you've heard of a lot of these different terms. So let's get into some of these concepts of the self that have been studied. So for example, self-concept, self-esteem, self-schema, and we'll start there. And that's where the chapter really starts. I'm just really going right along with the book chapter. So again, for those of you that are interested, it's African American Psychology by Belgrave and Allison, the 2019 version. So African American self has been studied more than any other topic. From 1939 through the 2000s, that's really been one of the main emphasis, particularly when it comes to African American psychology. The popular notion that African Americans suffered from low self-esteem because of a history of oppression has really not been supported, although even in the early 1900s and up and through the late 90s, that was the major part of the conversation. Self-concept organizes, and this is the definition for self-concept. Self-concept organizes and manages information about who we see or how we see ourselves. I'll say that again. Self-concept organizes and manages information about how we see ourselves. It is a component of our self-schema. Again, schema is that cognitive construction of who we are. So the questions we may ask when it comes to self-concept: do I believe I'm a smart person, I'm a good person, or I'm a brave person? But our constructions of those within our own mind is important. Self-schema again is a cognitive representation of the self. Self-esteem is one's affective or emotional reaction towards and feeling about oneself that is also an evaluation. And so you may ask yourself when it comes to self-esteem, do I even like myself? If you like yourself, there's some good implications for that. And if you don't, well, there's some other challenges. But it's not as straightforward. So I just want to lay a tag on the difference between self-concept and self-esteem. Some of the other ideas about self-worth, self-efficacy, this chapter doesn't necessarily get into. We'll get into that a bit more when we talk about attributions, but we do get quite a bit into self-concept, at least in some of the measures with that. So self-conceptualization and identity is kind of our next area we're getting into. And the conceptualization of the self depends on our own culture and how people socialize us or raise us to view the world, right, through social constructions of our identity. So there are interdependent cultures. The self is connected and linked within the surrounding social concept, and the self is considered in relation to others. So again, with these interdependent cultures, and usually research has shown that African American or African cultures, even Asian cultures, see themselves as more interdependent. So college or job decisions are connected to the family in more interdependent cultures. Not putting a value on it, just stating what it is. And also, if you're thinking of working cross-culturally, you can see where some of the conflict may arise, right? So more individualistic cultures, the emphasis is placed on the uniqueness of the self. So self-interest and personal well-being influence the decisions that are made. So if I'm thinking about college, I'm thinking more about how will this help me in the long run? How will this help me right now? Rather than how's this going to impact the family? So social identity is that part of an individual's self-concept that is derived from his membership in and adherence to the values associated with the culturally defined social group, right? So our social identity and our self-concept, comes from, this membership that we have in whatever, and our desire to be connected and adhere to whatever social group, right? Students coming to college can kind of experience kind of a coming a part of their social identity based upon their membership within a particular group or their sense of membership, if they haven't already wrestled with that. But if they've wrestled with that, it makes it easier, therefore academic achievement may be higher. But we'll get into that a little bit more. I'm just getting excited about these concepts. I'm a psych nerd, so you have to know that about me. Identity focuses on self-ascribed definitions that include social roles, reputations, values, and one of my favorite ones, possibilities. My identity, how I view my identity, can either raise or limit my possibilities, right? Social identity may include one's self-concept with relation to nationality, religion, gender, sexual orientation, age, health, status, racial and or ethnic identity. Again, racial and ethnic identity are two separate things, and are some scholars see race as salient, while other scholars may see ethnicity as more salient. Many people have multiple identities, despite all these different scholars' viewpoints. And Du Bois wrote about this a long time ago, really more around 1903, in his book, The Souls of Black Folk, and he talked particularly about a double consciousness or even a schizoid nature, kind of Black people feeling their two-ness, right? If you saw the light go off back there, I was listening to some Roy Ayers, red, black, and green. All right, so racial identity. Racial identity is based on the perception of a shared racial history, a sense of group or collective identity based upon one's perception that he or she shares a common racial heritage with a particular racial group, right? And this group definition comes from Helms in 1990. And, as I was thinking about it, I was thinking there may be a challenge with this definition, particularly around one's perception. I've seen in the news more recently, a couple of years ago, and even more this week, people who feel themselves to be transracial, and that may pose a challenge in regards to racial identity. But yet, it opens us up for a whole other conversations about transracial pieces. The book didn't bring that out, and the book may have been finished before a lot of this stuff had come out, but just a thought about the perception of a shared racial history. Perception is one thing, but also actual shared racial history, I think, is important as well. Other identity constructs around sexuality, gender, acculturation, racial socialization, Afrocentric values go into what is the construction of a person's identity. In particular, we're talking about African Americans, all those pieces go there. Racial socialization is a process involving messages and behaviors about race that parents or other members of a person's social context transmit to children and adolescents. And finally, Afrocentric values are the beliefs, attitudes, and worldview that come from people of African descent, and that's what we discussed a bit in chapter 2, but it's good to kind of review those when we're looking at a racial identity. So I mentioned intersectionality before, and Crenshaw in 1989 coined the term to address continued absence of the unique situation of African American women in the single framework found in both anti-racist and feminist theory. Again, intersectionality is a term to address continued absence of the unique situation of African American women in the single framework found in both anti-racist and feminist theory. In other words, Black folk were seen as kind of unidimensional, right? And not really going along with Du Bois's idea of a double consciousness where you have just a basic intersection, but that there are multiples, right? And so if we continue to talk about intersectionality, it's defined as a theoretical framework that seeks to understand how multiple social identities, right, including race, gender, sexual identity, and disability, among others, intersect within the individual in considering multiple interacting levels of social identity. Right. So if you come from a large city like I did, San Diego, Los Angeles, where there's a bunch of freeways and intersections, this resonates with me all the more as I think about I may get off at this intersection. Although I'm from LA or Long Beach, I know if I get off at this intersection, I'm going to have a very different quality of experience if I understand. But I'm also able to explain to people who understand the intersections that I've lived in and driven past and got on and got off. They better understand kind of where I'm coming from. I'm better able to orient them to my life and my experiences if they understand the intersections of my life, if I can borrow that phrasing, right? So this theory has been mostly applied to addressing issues that girls and women face, right? So vocation, right, their jobs, or as well as gender and how they identify their gender constructs and experiences, relationships, right, and health. But also challenges men face when it comes to facing discrimination and health choices. And the book didn't bring this out, and I haven't heard too many people talk about this other than Dr. Tommy Curry. But when I think about Black men and gender and intersectionalities, there was a period where Black men weren't considered human, and yet just a little bit above that, they might use the term boy. I saw this more recently in the movie about Beale Street, you know, James Baldwin's story about a family and about a brother who gets locked up in jail. And I won't say more, don't want to spoil it for those who haven't seen it, but he has an interaction with the police officer who calls him boy, right? And this construction of boy, right? It has a very particular gendered notion, especially when you're talking to a grown man and calling him a boy, right? And so these superimposed identities, right, and fighting back against those identities, all those pieces are kind of meshed up in there. And I'll talk a bit more about Dr. Curry's theory, but just wanted to lay a tag there for a moment. Right, so Black self-concept, right? And in my notes here, I have some pictures here talking, or at least illustrating Kenneth and Mamie Clark's 1939 study, which was used to back the Brown versus Board of Education Supreme Court decision in 1954 to integrate schools. And one of the main premises behind the research study, right, the doll study, was that if we integrate, Black self-esteem will rise, right? Cardiner and Ovesey, and I hope I'm saying those names right, 1951 and 62, they took a deficit model approach, but they were generally saying that something's wrong with the self-esteem of Black people because they've experienced so much oppression. And there were many problems pointed out with the aforementioned studies when it came to methodology and replication, particularly the doll studies. One of the bigger challenges is that once young people got older and had more sophisticated constructs of who they were, choosing a Black doll versus a white doll and ascribing attributions to whether the doll was ugly, smart, or beautiful became more muddied and became more balanced, especially by the time they became middle school age. But reproducing this study was difficult to do at other ages. And then this whole idea that there's something wrong with Black people, or that we can't get to the point of understanding Black people's resilience within our research, is challenged with some of these notions of self-concept. But people still base some of their ideas based upon these because they were such powerful benchmarks in American history, particularly the Brown versus Board of Education decision. All right, so that brings us to identity development. And, you know, one of the things I discovered early on in my career as a school psychologist, working with children, and particularly working with kindergarten children, is that in the preschool years, American children understand racial categories. Their parents didn't quite get this. And I started doing this work in the mid-90s. So parents were still very unsure as to whether or not if they actually kept their children from talking about race. And as long as they could, they wouldn't have to feel the effects of race. But it was too late, because by preschool they had already done it, and studies have continued to show that by preschool, American children understand racial categories, group membership, and broad cultural attributions and biases. So by the time they get to kindergarten, they're already into this thing. Identity formation begins at birth, but continues throughout life. And Black youth may definitely go beyond Erikson's and Marcia's stages of identity development, but not, they don't necessarily have a diffuse identity in large sample studies, which, again, going back to some of the deficit model thinking, if you're thinking that Black people have been so oppressed that they have difficulty with self-esteem and their identity may be diffuse, and they may have difficulty kind of relating and understanding who they are, much of that has been debunked. Much of the research on identity development has been with adolescents, right? They can answer your questions, one, right? That's one of the basics. They can answer your questions, but also they've gone through most of the stages too, or they should have. So I placed in some of the notes just a reminder about Erikson and Marcia's kind of viewpoints there. All right, man, I'm really trying to get through these slides. I'm already 20 minutes in, so let me keep moving. Okay, so William Cross, Black identity development that was later enhanced by Helms, Parham, and Thomas. Also updated some of the conversations, but I'll go through that briefly, right? Most folks, and particularly Black folks living in America, are walking through this pre-encounter stage. They haven't encountered any kind of issues, and then bam, once they get hit with this racist situation, they experience some type of dissonance or an encounter that leads to having them acknowledge the impact of race, and they eventually immerse themselves within Black culture to understand this more, or to try to sometimes even get some very direct help, right? And if they are able to emerge from this, right, they have internalized a particular commitment to African people, right? And this internalization can lead to a commitment that allows them to stand on the stage of history. If I could kind of channel, and I would classify him as a mentor, Dr. Maulana Karenga. If I could channel Dr. Maulana Karenga a little bit, he would say to be able to stand on stage of human history, right? And be able to step out with some power because you know exactly who you are. So you're able to step forward for some win-win situations. And this internalization and commitment to be able to maybe even work on some of the intersections beyond just race, gender, class, but also to have an impact on the world. So a brother like Fred Hampton or Martin Luther King or Shirley Chisholm or Barbara Jordan have come to represent this idea of this internalization commitment, meaning and having greater impact on people beyond just the day-to-day, right? Or beyond just kind of an in-group kind of interaction, that their impact is much greater and broader, right? That's kind of the basics of it, but we'll get into that. I put it in the notes, but you can find William Cross's Black identity development all over the internet. You can find it in most Black psychology textbooks. So, and not to give it a poor treatment, but your reading it will be a much better treatment than I can give it in the amount of time that I have here. Right, so some of these scales that have gone along with Cross's identity development, particularly the nigrescence model by Cross, Parham and Helms have developed the racial attitude identity scale. There is also MMRI by Chavis in 1998, which is a multi-dimensional model of racial identity, and it builds on symbolic interaction and outlines 4 primary dimensions of racial identity: the salience, centrality, and ideology, right? Like you have a nationalist, oppressed, assimilationist, a humanist, and you have public or private regard for that group that you may be a part of. There's a multi-dimensional model of Black identity. It's based upon the latter one, the MMRI, and looks basically at centrality, ideology, and regard, just the 3. There's also the multi-ethnic identity measure, and it's a general measure of ethnic identity by Finity that was developed in the early 90s. The multi-construct of African American identity questionnaire, MICAQ, I don't know. Psychologists like to make up names for scales, but it's for youth from 11 to 18 years old: socialization, appearance, attitude, and other group orientation by Smith and Boykins in the late 90s. right? And so people have used these identity scales to do research studies. And so what's come out of some of these studies is that less educated, lower income folks and some urban folks were more likely to be in the pre-encounter than an immersion stage, right? They hadn't had any type of dissonance that had pushed them out of that, right? Men and older participants were more likely to be in the internalization than an immersion stage, which is interesting. And I was thinking that maybe because more folks went to college, as I was looking at these studies, but also men may go to work and have more interactions, similar to these men more recently who posted about their experiences at the General Motors plant, and people were writing whites only signs and hanging nooses. This is like 2016, 2018, somewhere around that time, right? So also the studies have shown individuals in the pre-encounter stage were most satisfied, but those in an internalization stage were the next most satisfied, or the second most satisfied with their life experiences overall. Emergent stagers were the least satisfied, right? And to some degree, when I first learned about these stages, being immersed meant that I was really angry, right? I had my Malcolm X cap on after the 1992 riots, didn't want to talk to white people, didn't want to deal with white people. Funny enough, I only dated white people up to that point. But once I immersed myself, listened to Public Enemy exclusively, reading only black textbooks, reading only black books, and I decided to go to a historically black college, right? And I eventually emerged out of that, right? But there was a period where I was definitely not satisfied. Although pre-encounters reported high psychological well-being, they had the lowest level of global self-esteem, right? And with that lowest level of global self-esteem, that can lead to more problems. While internalization types had the highest levels of self-esteem, which is interesting. Okay. So you can see kind of the balance there, right? I can be kind of blissfully ignorant in the pre-encounter stage, right? But if I make it through to the other side, not only am I more satisfied with life, but I'm better able to kind of deal with some of these other things that come along in my life too. So it is worth it to go through the journey, although the journey can be a challenge and painful at times. We're talking about well-being and achievement, particularly academic achievement, and high racial and ethnic identity have been found to be associated with positive psychological well-being. This has been found across several racial and ethnic groups from 2005 to 2017 studies as well. There's a link to ethnic identity and black culture in the 1990s and 2000s, and has been seen as a protective mechanism to reduce the risk of rejection and lowered esteem. At times, black American students have devalued education, right? But more recent studies, right? And this was in the 90s and 2000s, people were wondering about, black students devaluing education, maybe even black families devaluing education. But more recent studies have more frequently identified ethnic or racial identity as a positive factor for academic success. Higher ethnic affirmation was associated with higher academic engagement, right? So likely even working through that all the way through that internalization phase. Students with high Eurocentric identity scores tended to have lower academic achievement compared to students with high scores on Afrocentric identity scales. So, there's this, again, kind of delicate balance. On the surface, when we look at it and we say, the more assimilated, the more aligned a student is with your Eurocentric values, the more likely they are to do well in school, but that's not necessarily the case. There's a whole conversation back in the 90s, and it keeps cropping up from time to time about, black students being teased by other black students for acting white, right? And this phenomenon was observed by someone who was not an African American, but a Nigerian American, although he was looking at African Americans in California. And his view of these African Americans in California was that they were teasing each other and giving each other a hard time about academic success. But a lot of that has been debunked by more teenage in-group, out-group teasing And nonetheless, those students still, as long as they identified with some level of their Afrocentric identity, right? As we've looked at it in the different constructs that we've seen, as we looked at it in chapter 2, right? They tended to do well academically. So I don't put as much stock into that type of concern. But I do try, if I do run into it, particularly if I've run into it in clinical setting, I try to encourage the young people and their family to develop a stronger Afrocentric identity. And that stronger Afrocentric identity doesn't necessarily mean I dislike other people. It means I'm more aware of and appreciative of who I am. Right. Okay. So when it comes to identity and behavior, some of the studies that have been looked at, positive ethnic identity protects against drug use, right? Risky sexual behavior, juvenile delinquency, and violence. Right? If I see myself as worthy and understand who I am, I'm less likely to put myself in bad situations, right? Or the community, right? If I go with the more, interdependent cultural viewpoint, the community is less likely to allow me to even be in those situations. So stronger ethnic identity may support better relationships with parents, which can lead to better problem solving and less seeking of support from peers. Also, it buffers against low self-esteem and feelings of incompetence. I touch a little bit on self-efficacy, but self-efficacy is about whether or not I'm able to feel that I'm effective. And if I can buffer against low self-esteem and also this other concern, because self-efficacy is more related to academic achievement, then I'm able to do a bit better in school and other life outcomes. Interesting, higher ethnic identity for white youth led to higher drug use. Yet for black youth, it was the inverse, in that higher ethnic identity led to less drug use for black youth. There's some pieces there, and I have my own hypothesis based upon my upbringing around mostly white youth. And some of them were, high white ethnic identity led them to in acts of misbehavior, like, join skinhead groups and that type of thing, which can lead to greater drug use. But I don't know, this section isn't necessarily about that piece, but I have some thoughts on it, right? Okay, the media and identity. Sociology and communication scholars have researched this the most. Psychologists haven't quite gotten into it as much, but there's definitely a negative impact of media on the self, especially with the media portraying negative or bad images of African Americans. African American youth consume the most TV hours per week, like 11 hours per week compared to 8 or 9 going down with other ethnic groups. Music videos reinforce certain scripts, like certain old tropes like a freak or a gold digger, and other ones that your book listed out. Social media can also lead to a higher perception of discrimination, but this is new research. But as folks consume social media, my sense is that they are working through some of those stages, and every once in a while they might go through an encounter while on social media. They post an idea that they think everybody else has, and then somebody challenges them on that idea, right? And I'll give you an example, right, where conversations happen on social media in regards to LGBT issues, and that brings us to our other section here, right? And so their studies are too few to make very broad generalizations about Black LGBT folks, but the ones we do have do tell us, as with prior identity development models, Blackness offers another lens to view identity. Boleg in 2013 found that race often preceded sexual identity, and that support for intersectionality of gender, race, and sexuality helped to identify barriers and benefits the men in Boleg's studies face. And one of the things that the men, or consistent theme that came across, is that it's hard for me to separate my identities of, gender, race, sexuality, right? So confronting the intersections, of Black queer and gendered life amidst the backdrop of stereotypes by Black people in general, as well as, white LGBT folks, right, who may not fully accept or understand Black LGBT folks. But confronting this, all these intersections here, for the men in Bullock's study, spurred their own individual growth and their resilience. And to some degree, as I was talking about, kind of making it to the other side of identity development, it was important for them to do that. So I'm going to mention a term called the CIA, or conflicts in allegiances. So conflicts in whether I'm LGBT, whether I'm more African American, and if those allegiances kind of clash, right? These CIAs or conflicts in allegiances can lead to higher levels of depression for LGBT folks, right? Dr. Bobby Wright spoke about some of these conflicts of allegiances in the 1970s and 80s. Morales spoke about them, and Santos and Vanderleen also spoke about them more recently. Okay. All right, acculturation. Okay. And I'm going to define it and then get into some of these studies related to acculturation. Acculturation refers to the extent ethnic minorities participate in the cultural traditions, values, beliefs, and practices of their own culture versus the mainstream or white culture. And that's from Landon and Klondorf in 1996. African American college youth found that religious practice was a protective factor against drug use. Right? And we've talked about that before, and we may get into a bit more as we get into one of our youth chapters, but that's an interesting finding, right? A study on Jamaican adolescents described a form of non-immigrant acculturation called Americanizations among early adolescent Jamaican youth. So the Americanized Jamaican adolescents reported a stronger European American cultural orientation, lower Jamaican orientation, which led to lower family obligations and greater conflict with families. So this Americanization was actually something to watch out for when it came to Jamaican immigrant families. Interesting piece on acculturation, right? So racial socialization, and here's a definition. It involves messages and practices that provide information concerning one's race as it relates to a persona and group identity, intergroup and inter-individual relationships, and a position in the social hierarchy, according to Hill in '99. So there's parent messages as well that can go with racial socialization, right? So you have your minority status, which may lead to you staying to your child. You got to accept your color. You got to accept kind of your station in life. You may have your mainstream kind of viewpoints that hard work will pay off in a good life, right? And you may have your Black experience, right? It's important to study Black culture and Black history. One of the above may be emphasized more than the other, or, your parents, like my parents, may have done all three. These messages can be proactive and protective, I should say, against discrimination and racism. It helps children evaluate situations and respond appropriately if they're at least receiving some of these types of messages. Racialized socialization is important. It has to be intentional. And I've said this in my work with many parents. You have to be intentional about how you raise your children, and you have to have a narrative. Racism happens, right? But in order to counter it, you have to be strategic and intentional. All right. So that brings us in our last section here. We'll be talking about gender very largely, and we'll start here with feminism. And the book gives a dictionary definition, so I'm going to go with that. The theory of political, economic, and social equality of the sexes, right? But it also acknowledges that feminism can vary based on race or ethnicity. African Americans were least likely to report themselves as feminists in a couple of studies, although African Americans identified with feminist values. I'm particularly talking about African American women. They did not self-identify as feminists. And African American women's path to freedom and compared to white women's path to, path to feminism, and compared to white women's path to feminism. So justice, equality in pay, educational equity was not the same as was white women's kind of experience. White women came into seeing feminism as a part of their lives through their educational status, right? They went to and completed college, right? And that gave them a certain level of status, but also their marital status, their religion, and their acceptance of LGBT people. These things were not major factors in predicting feminist values for African American women, but again, justice, equality in pay, and educational equity were, right? And that's slightly different in educational status, I'll say that. Black men who are feminists. There was one study with about 25 men and talked about that these men who were identified as feminists had written scholarship as well as women who vouched for them as feminists, right? And this was a 2006 study by White. And White wrote that these men had been introduced to feminism through a gender-based conference or had worked at a feminist nonprofit. They had a friendship with a sex worker and had seen that person exploited, or they had a relationship with a feminist daughter who had had a divorce, right? Interesting conversations about feminism. And I think Alice Walker, who's considered by many to be a progressive, coined the term in 1983, womanism, right? And we'll define this, at least according to what the book is saying. A womanist is a black feminist or feminist of color who is committed to the survival and wholeness of entire people, male and female. A womanist does not create a hierarchy between the fight against racism and sexism, but embraces both as necessary. There was a period in my life, and I'm just giving my kind of viewpoint. I really was like, oh wow, I need to be a feminist, man. I have a little sister, I have many aunts, I got a mama who loves me to death. But when I saw this definition, that's more of what I was interested in, but also kind of express where I was at. Alice Walker and I may disagree on many different things, but you know, where the fight is and that there needs to be a fight, we agree on, right? Okay. So some other components that womanism looks at is poverty, racism, ethnocentrism, and gender identities. Gender roles are focused on psychosocial adaptation and not necessarily being locked into certain things. So, you know, women having to make more money than men or having to, you know, go out into the workforce and that type of thing creates a certain adaptation. But that adaptation likely with black folk, if I go back to Sojourner Truth and her poem, Ain't I a Man Too, speaks to that, right? There's a study about women in co-ed HBCUs scoring higher on womanist scales, right? But also they talked about in the book, at a co-educational campus, women may have to look for more opportunities to discuss such things. Right? And I could say that's a very real situation here at Oakwood. I'm almost cringing at my own self having to be the one speaking about feminism and womanism. And I haven't heard too many other Oakwood professors say those terms out loud. I'm just keeping it 100 at this moment. All right. And we just got a few more areas left, and the last two are on masculinity, right? Research, masculinity and hypermasculinity is a topic we're finishing up here, but research has been mixed on masculinity and stereotype views compared to white peers, right? So particularly African-American men in college have higher gender role stress than their white peers, according to Norwalk in 2011. Less traditional views of masculinity were associated with fewer sexual partners, right? Masculine identity messages can influence behavior for adolescents and definitely those who are going into college, right? Or that college age. Here's the definition of this hypermasculinity. Is an exaggerated form of masculinity characterized by physical and emotional toughness, aggressiveness, and an emphasis on wealth. Interesting piece, right? If I were to look at hypermasculinity and look at the current state of black wealth, that would leave out a lot of black men, at least that last part, right? I'm in that group. I ain't got no wealth. Zero, right? Males in disorganized neighborhood with high crime rates tend to be more hyper-masculine. Okay. Wow. Well, okay. They may emphasize wealth, but do they have wealth? Again, I just pose that question. When education and employment accepted or traditional ways of showing masculinity are hard to obtain, hypermasculinity appears to be another way, according to Seaton's 2007 study, right? So we talked a little bit about masculinity and hypermasculinity. It doesn't quite give us a sense of empowerment, right, as womanism did, or even feminism. But let me move forward. Phallicism, which is a new theory, and I'm adding this, it's not in the book, but it's by Dr. Thomas J. Curry, provides a new theory to consider. And I'm going to read his words from the abstract from his study, which I have, and we'll discuss that more in our class. I'm sorry, you're just going to have to be at Oakwood to get the chance to discuss it more. But caricatures of black men and boys are not rooted in studies or empirical findings, is what Dr. Curry has written. But the stereotypes found throughout various racist social scientific literatures that held black males to be effeminate while nonetheless hypermasculine and delinquent. Right? So contemporary gender theories not only deny the peculiar sexual oppression of racialized outgroup males under patriarchy, but theories like intersectional invisibility actually perpetuates the idea that racialized males are disposable. Again, I go back to that concept of black people not even seen as human beings. And then once they were, you were still considered a boy or a girl, even though you were a fully grown adult person in charge of taking care of even white people's children, right? But yet you were still called boy or girl, and you weren't considered a full citizen as well, right? Within that context, it's difficult to discuss what we typically know as patriarchy or masculinity or femininity. There's a different lens that you have to use when you look at those things. And Dr. Curry is advocating for some more empirically based research that helps give us some ways to solve the challenges that particularly black males face, particularly when we look at all the research studies about birth rates, about education, about incarceration, about death rates, right? These are important areas to consider. Okay. As we come to a close, the book talks about rites of passage programs. There's many other programs out there, but I think it's important to consider these rites of passage programs, particularly as African Americans. We're denied so many of them. Are in ancient times in Timbuktu, in Kemet or Egypt, villages all over Africa. There was tiered mentoring from 8 years old to 80 years old and beyond, right? The book offers Brookings' Adolescent Development Pathway Paradigm, ADPP. Again, Brookings' 1999 Adolescent Development Pathway Paradigm. And he looked at 4 different areas. Preparation and awareness, right? This time where you prepared and you're given information, right? And then the second stage is separation, right? You're taken away, and this is kind of a scary stage for a lot of folks, parents and the young people. But they're taken away in order to be introduced to some concepts that can only get through that shared group experience, but also being away from what they had known before, right? And then there's a transition where they begin to know new things, right? And new things about themselves as they've been separated, right? And then the last stage is reincorporation. So I'll say those again: preparation, awareness, separation, transition, reincorporation. These are important parts of rites of passage programs. If I look back and I have the privilege of being a great Facebook friend and talking to him on the phone, Dr. Nathan Hare and his wife Julia Hare, they really, and they were both psychologists, and they introduced rites of passage programs, or reintroduced them to America. And wow, just to be able to be a part of that and share that with young people, and to have that reintroduced after it was taken away from so many Africans in America due to enslavement, I think is an important part of our healing moving forward. And I'm talking about healing the people all over the world. When you're separated from who you are as part of the human family, you're disjointed and you don't really, it's difficult to contribute. All right, so as we end here, I have some questions, and we'll be discussing these in our class here at Oakwood, but one of my first questions here: for North, Central, and South American and Caribbean African descendants, our identity has been in question for so long When we find out who we are, what do we base that on? When we find out who we are, what do we base that on? Right? Do we go all the way back to ancient, African writings? Do we go back at least across, the ocean to our more contemporary versions of our African selves? I don't know, but that's a question I got and one I wrestle with. Okay. Knowing that studies have shown that high levels, and this is our next question, knowing that studies have shown that high levels of internalization of African identity leads to higher self-esteem, academic outcomes, and other positive effects, what can we do to better inform our family and community members? Right. We got to get this word out there that being African is better for you. Better for your mind, better for your academic achievement, even better for your health. How do we get that word out there? I don't know. I'm open to that. The intersections of gender, race, ethnicity, sexuality, class, etc. are important for us to explore. However, in the context of Black people's newfound legal humanity, right? It's only been 60 some odd years that we've been able to legally go about our business here in these United States. If I go to South Africa, they've got maybe 30 some odd years in, right? Where is our current collective identity when it comes to that? I'll say that again. We got these intersections of gender, race, ethnicity, sexuality, class, etc. They're all important for us to explore. However, in the context of Black people's newfound legal humanity, where is the current collective identity? And I also think in our current political climate, and I say current, I'm talking like from George W. Bush through Barack Obama, all the way through the current Trump administration, there's a political climate that is not always conducive to Black life here in America and throughout the world. How do we come together to solve the challenges that we need to solve? There's a balance there, and I don't know where we begin or enter, but it's a good starting point for us to begin. And I'm sure there's many more, and if you'd like to join a discussion, if you like my notes that I have here from Belgrave and Allison's 2019 book, African American Psychology, I'd be more than happy to share them with you. I have them down in the section below. Sorry this took so long, but that's class. All right. Hope all is well with you, and yeah, hope you enjoyed this, and if you did, please follow along. Have a blessed day. Bye.